Who were the richest men in the U.S. South at the time that the Civil War began? This is an important question to ask because money shapes politics, and politics shapes the greater society. Why would a significant portion of the Southern population go to war to protect slavery when most people in the South didn't even own slaves? In fact, only about one fourth of the households in the U.S. South owned slaves. So I first thought about this question more intuitively before I actually went searching for the answer, and a couple of things. The first thing that came to mind is, well, the poor whites or the middle class whites in the South were probably manipulated by the rich whites to go to war and to fight their battle. That was one of my intuitions, and another was that, well, people, of course, status means a lot to people. People are willing to do a lot to achieve status and maintain status. Um, so I could imagine that people would go to war to protect this almost inherent status that slavery has built for them. Another was that it would affect the economy, but then again, that wouldn't affect the people that didn't even own slaves. They were already working their jobs. Um, but the one aspect that it would affect is competition for jobs and economic competition. They didn't want to have additional economic competition from slaves. And all these intuitions turned out to be true. Um, and this was evident through a couple things. The first being the draft. The Confederate Army instituted what was the first draft in U.S. history. So initially, that wasn't necessary, but eventually it was. So what this tells me is that people were willing to fight and die to protect slavery, um, or to make slavery remain. But then eventually they weren't. It wasn't something they were willing to die for. I mean, I really can't even fathom dying to protect to maintain slavery in the first place. It almost seems silly to me, especially if you don't own slaves. Um, but people eventually apparently realized that, yeah, it's not worth dying for, so they weren't willing to fight in the army. And what the rich whites did, the people in charge of the Confederacy, well, they instituted a draft. Well, you have to join the army now. And to make matters worse, or to further exemplify this point, apparently the Confederacy implemented a rule named the something like the 20 Negroes Law, which said that slave owners that had more than 20 slaves, or yeah, slave owners that owned more than 20 slaves did not have to register for the draft, which led to quite a bit of resentment between the poor and the rich in the South, with this common phrase starting to emerge, which was that the Civil War was a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. I would say that oftentimes this is what I would say that oftentimes this is what war is, not just in the Civil War. Even today, people with lower economic status are much more likely to join the army because they get things like, they're going to get housing, they're going to get a job, they're going to get educate access to education. They're going to get these things that rich people can just afford to pay for without having to go into any debt. Um, so in general, this is true, but there are certain causes that transcend. There are certain causes that even the rich are willing to die for. That even people with a comfortable life are willing to risk their life in order to protect. I think certain wars you can look at, and you can see this. The Revolutionary War, I think, is one. You know, people living in America fought for their political rights, for their political representation, and and I'd say for the Union at least, this is another one of those wars. It's a war against, in a way, good versus evil. Um, it's a fight for, you know protecting certain values like, freedom, the belief that all men are created equal, and other wars do not have so much moral virtue, and therefore do not get as much support from populations. For example, the Vietnam War or the wars in the Middle East. A lot of people do not feel those are just wars. They feel these are colonial wars. These are wars over greed, um, that the rich make the poor fight for them. So this is really what I view the Civil War as from the perspective of the South. It's the rich making the poor fight for them to stay rich, essentially. And for the North, many of them feel this is a fight to keep the country as one. It's a fight against good versus evil, or right versus wrong. It's a fight to protect the value of freedom and the belief that all men are created equal. And I feel like this is not a lens that people view the Civil War through, because people normally kind of have the perception that, well, the South is just kind of one agglomeration of individuals, but really it's a bunch of different individuals with a bunch of different realities, and a bunch of different motivations. The rich, those who are already rich, have a lot more at stake than what the poor do. And if they have political control over the poor, over the masses, they can make them go die for their wealth, to protect their wealth, because they have that choice. They have that control, that they have that level of control over resources. And once they, secede, they create their own, um, army, their own nation. Then they have the ability to do things like, you know, they can tax the poor, they can, you know, institute a draft, they can make them go fight. No doubt for some, the end of slavery, maybe probably decrease their quality of living. um, but for many, it probably didn't, honestly. So, who are these individuals that made the poor go to die? I think that's a question that we can ask ourselves throughout time, because the rich change over time. The richest person in America at the time of the Revolutionary War was different than the richest person at the time of 1812, and the richest person at the time of eight of the Civil War and the richest person at the time of World War One and World War Two. But generally speaking, those are the people that have the most influence over society. Old money usually builds up more political control, but the new money, the wealthiest, are normally the next scions, the next people to build up that level of political control where they are truly shaping and deciding the direction that a society goes into. Um, and at the time of the 1850s, well, there's the rich Southerners, they're all slave owners. There's the rich Northerners, um, to kind of do a variety of things. A lot of them are in, well, at this time, I guess, in rail. You have Cornelius Vanderbilt. You have John Jacob. The children of John Jacob Astor, William Backhouse Astor, um, who made their money in fur trade and put a lot of money into real estate. Um, so you can really kind of view the lenses. These are the people in control of society, shaping the direction of society, and they of course kind of dictate the choices of the masses in many ways. But what are their motivations? I mean, just because someone's dictating the 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 decisions and the direction doesn't necessarily make them bad. It's just kind of the way things are. But in the South, making someone die to protect slavery isn't quite as right. Is is clearly morally inferior to those in the North saying we should you should go die to end slavery and protect the values of freedom and the belief that all men are created equal and to protect our union that others have already died for, um, to put these some to implement some of these values. um, so I think these are the lens to view the Civil War through, and society and politics in general. Um, but thinking about this made me ask a lot of questions that I hadn't thought to think that I hadn't thought to ask before. Another question that I had that popped up in my mind was, why did slavery concentrate in the South? Could have concentrated in the West or the North or the East. There's nothing inherent about the South that is racist. You know, but for some reason it didn't. And that reason is because the South had a higher demand for unpaid labor. Obviously, unpaid labor is going to have some level of value anywhere, but it has a much higher value in certain areas. The European empires, primarily the English, Spanish, Portuguese, they were the nations facilitating the slave trade. And if you look at the number of slaves that went, you know, most of the slaves were from Africa, but they could have sent the slaves anywhere. They could have sent them back to Europe. They could have sent them to South America, North America. They could have sent them out to Asia, but they sent them to America. They sent them to North America, and actually, they sent more to South America. Why is that? Well, the reason is that America as well, they're being settled. They have some people. They're not as populated as Europe, but they have a lot of land that can be farmed and that can produce, you know, crops of value: sugar, rice, tobacco, cotton. And so because there's this excess of high quality farmland and plenty of space, there's a more significant demand for slaves. So that's ultimately why they sent slaves to the Americas as opposed to sending them back to England. I mean, some went back to England or wherever in Europe, but most vast majority went to the Americas. And so, if you really look at why slavery even kind of exists, is it's really an economic tool. And I feel that's a better way to look at it, as opposed to look at, well, the South they're bad and the North they're good, they're so morally superior. I don't really see it that way, to be honest. Um, the North just didn't have as much of a demand for slave labor as the South did, and that's why most of the slave labor was in the South. Simple as that. So I find it useful to just view things pragmatically, intellectually honest, um, and almost from a mechanical perspective of why did things develop the way they did, versus trying to prescribe some spiritual or moral virtue on things in some mysterious way, or to come up with some moral justification of why things are the way they are. It's that, these people are bad and these people are good. It was That's not the case. It was more of a economic function, an economic outcome. And sure, there were moral factors that, played into, I mean, ultimately slavery was abolished, and you could say, well, what incentive did the North have to abolish slavery? I mean, it probably, I mean, if you're taxing the South and all of a sudden you don't have, slave labor to tax, maybe I mean, maybe I honestly don't know if ending slavery hurt the federal government or if it hurt the North. Um, I guess I should think about that a little more. But there it did evolve that there was a reason. So maybe the moral factor wasn't, completely insignificant. Maybe it did play some part, or maybe it was just that people really believed in these American values that had already been laid out, at this point almost 100 years previous, and that they were really starting to that America was starting to mature, and that perhaps there's time to be more serious about upholding the values. Maybe that's what it was. I don't know. I'll need to think about that. Maybe that's a thought exercise or a contemplation for another episode. But if you've watched to this point, thanks for watching my entire video. Hit that smash that like button. Subscribe if you're not already, and see you in the next video.